Okay, Abby, can I just check you can both see and hear me before I start?
Yeah, everything's good.
Excellent, thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody. I think people will continue to join us over the next few minutes, but let's crack on and use the time to the best. So, welcome today to this last in the 3 series of webinars co-produced with the British Standards Institution and other partners, looking at resilience and continuity. Concentrating on some of the lessons and experiences, the knowledge we've gained throughout the COVID pandemic crisis, the global crisis. As I say, this is the third in a 3-part series of webinars. The previous 2 have been brilliant, actually, I have to say. Excellent participation from people, have really generated some great discussions. So I am absolutely sure this one will be no different. Today, though, we're going to actually examine and concentrate in more on the human aspects of the COVID pandemic and exactly what that means for organisational learning, for psychological health and well-being, for example, but also for kind of safe working practices. You know, what have we gained? What have we learned differently about how to work in this new world post-pandemic, and for managing some of the psychosocial risks? And we're also going to have a look at a really important issue around access and inclusivity from some of the experiences, and again, what we can learn going forward to improve the world for people who maybe don't have the same level of accessibility that we all do. We'll then look at a range of emerging lessons from around the world and some of the standards that are now contributing in quite a strong world, certainly here in the UK and beyond, indeed, around international standards as well. All of which, of course, are looking to contribute towards that longer term goal of strengthening and building our resilience to future shocks, whatever they might look like. We've got a great panel of speakers today from both the British Standards Institution, but also from the University of Manchester. With me today is Dave Adamson, who I'm going to introduce now and ask to start the webinar. Dave, please. Dave is the Lead Standards Development Manager for BSI. He is based in London, is active in standardization, in governance, risk, compliance, resilience, continuity, and crisis management. He's been involved in a range of national, international, European projects, critically building some of the most important ISOs, so Crisis Management 9001, Quality 22301, Continuity 31000, etc. Dave joined BSI from Bupa Dunedin Hospital, where he was responsible for business development, prior to which he had a fruitful career in publishing, working in editorial, production, and commissioning, capping his publishing activities at the Taylor and Francis Group as marketing manager. Dave, it's been fantastic working with you over the 3 webinars, and without any further ado, I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thank you, David. And thanks to the University of Manchester for cooperating with British Standards Institution on these session of resilience and continuity. So I just wanted to go through a little bit about BSI, about standards, and then note some particular standards. This won't take too long. I've got 5 minutes to do this. The first is a picture I always like to show. It's the beginning of standards. It was founded by Sir John Barry Wolfe, or Wolfe Barry, I think, John Wolfe Barry, the man who designed London's Tower Bridge. He did that in 1901, and he did it with these gentlemen, the Engineering Standards Committee. So from that, it expanded. They were interested in tram lines, trying to standardize or come to an agreement amongst the various organizations producing the steel sections of tram lines. They wanted to produce fewer because they had nearly 100 different thicknesses. So by bringing it down to like under 10, they were to reap a lot of economic and economic business or benefits. So the group in between 1901 and 2021, it's now an organization that's diversified. It now is an acquisition company. It had royal charter that enables it to acquire other businesses and diversify. The one thing that I point out in this slide is the little kite mark at the right-hand corner. We're speaking of old. The kite mark was registered first in 1903. So when the UK adults over 80% of the UK population, adult population, recognize that kite mark. The other thing people quite often ask is it part of government? Is BSI part of government? The answer is no, but it works closely with various departments of the government to advance public interest, particularly BEIS, the Business, Energy, Innovation, and Skills. And the other thing to note with standardization bodies is each country has one. So BSI is a standards body that cooperates with the IEC, the ISO, International Standardization Organization, and SANT, the European Standardization Body. This next slide really just recaps how once BSI had started off with an engineering committee to what it is now, BSI Group, that it has really diversified to about 180 countries around the world where it's operating. The interesting thing, though, is that the core of the activities, it's located in Chiswick, in London, and that's where all the standardization activities take place. And we'll note that the revenue that comes from BSI is largely generated from the assessment and certification work based on management systems. So what's the standard? Quickly, it's an agreed, repeatable way of doing things. But the trick is, the challenge is to get the stakeholders or those people around the table, get them around the table in the first instance, it's challenging enough. But then to have a lack of sustained opposition to something. That's really what consensus is. And it's also to note that the standards themselves, the thousands of standards that BSI produces in ISO, they're all voluntary. Now, there can be legislation that call them up, but they, in themselves, they're voluntary. And they come in different forms or types. So you see the requirements, sometimes called a specification or certification standard. And some of the ones we'll look at today, they might be have a prefix of a PD or a PAS or a TS. The trick is there, do they have a number following that prefix? If they do, it'll probably look and smell very much like a full standard because it's gone through some sort of consensus process. They're reviewed regularly and updated. And importantly, with the standards, all the standards, they're not just what is general practice, but if they're aspirational. The members are attempting to demonstrate or produce what can be a better way forward. And it does provide the opportunity for individuals to get together and to speak and to express themselves. So in themselves, just the development of standards, sometimes they don't always result in the standard, but they do result in other offshoots or benefits. For my last slide, before we turn over to the experts speaking on these particular standards, I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the standards that I've been involved with. Now, people around the table and people participating in the Zoom call, everyone will have their experience. Mine started with continuity. And continuity and resilience, some years ago, were having quite a debate to see which was going to have the upper hand. Continuity, this on the time scale of an incident occurring and the recovery to the pre-incident. So the continuity, that's what it was, recovering from an incident. Whereas resilience was supposed to mean so much more, perhaps in preparation, perhaps from magnitude or the wholeness of it, the holistic approach, but they were debating it. So BSI first came out with a standard on continuity. And after that became widespread and really accepted by the world, it was 25999, and it's now 22301. But a man named John Sharp said, yeah, but once this incident, which can be an emergency or a crisis, if you will, that's how we classify an incident. What about the people affected by those incidents? The organization wants to get back to the operational level that it had before the incident. That's clearly a goal or an objective. But what about those people who now are not used to working from home, or not able to work from home for psychological reasons or physical reasons, or there are different aspects of human aspects. So we put it out there and it was remarkably popular. It resulted in an ISO. You notice a TS there, prefixing that. Again, I wouldn't even pay attention to it, to be perfectly honest with you, because they produce TSs instead of just sort of full ISOs, if you will, for various reasons. And Duncan's going to allude to his in a moment. But the main thing is it's a standard. So the 65,000, it occurred years after. And even now with resilience, we're still debating really what are the finer points, the meat of what is resilience. They published BS ISO 22316 on organizational resilience, but it never quite got the traction of the continuity. Maybe it was a difficult thing to really quantify or to measure, which often standards need in order to really be successful. Was the next three standards Duncan's gonna follow up on. I mean, the 22393, skipping down a few, the guidelines for planning, recovery, and renewal, and Rasheen, I'm sure she'll also be talking about that as well. But what Professor Duncan Shaw has done is taken this individual approach to producing a standard and here and there, but he's created a group, or he's earned a place in a group, actually, by his peers and international peers, and community resilience. And from that stems not only the 22319, the 22395, and the 22393, and there are others, mass evacuation, so he's done a wonderful job of bringing about the community as well as the individual, but the people aspects. Now, I know that Jean's going to be speaking on the 6463, and Sally's going to be talking about the 45,003. So that'll be fascinating to hear. I'd heard a little bit about those, so really looking forward to that. But I'll end with these last two that I'd just like to point out are on the way on travel risk management, because of course that impacts individuals, and crisis management, because if you can see from that, it's building a strategy, a strategic approach to crisis management. And having been involved with that very closely, you realize just what building that strategic approach involves. It's human beings, because we have to prepare, but also respond to crises. So I'd like to end now by thanking you for your attention, and also to mention that BSI, British Standards Institution, we do look for committee members. Without committee members, we can't produce these standards, wonderful standards. So please do maybe just Google becoming a BSI committee member. Maybe that's the easiest way. You'll see the benefits, responsibilities, the role. Duncan, I think I'm gonna pass that over to you. I'm gonna stop the share now, and hopefully you can pick up from there. I didn't say what a terrific guy you were. I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. So I'd just like to echo Dave's thanks to you all for joining, and how nice it is to have this third in the series of webinars with British Standards Institution. I'm going to talk about a particular standard that we've been developing and around planning, recovery and renewal. So this is a document that has been really worked on within the international standards community, and it's recently been published. Next slide, please, Roisin. And with Roisin, I'm going to talk through the contents of that ISO, and Roisin is going to take on looking at some of the human aspects around that. So the ISO began its development about a year ago, based on a whole lot of recovery guidance that is available within the UK and across the world. We looked at that recovery guidance, we looked at local recovery plans, we looked at the literature that was available in recovery, we talked with a lot of people. We talked with a whole range of experts across the world through a project that we're doing at the University of Manchester, sponsored by the ESRC. And we participated in a number of recovery coordination groups. And I can see from the audience, you represent a number of the local authorities within England that we were working with at the time. But we broadened that out to work with a whole range of different international partners as well. And all of that knowledge and experience that we learned from those excellent recovery groups, we brought together in this standard, which is ISO TS 22393. Next slide, please, Roisin. The standard draws upon all of the information that you saw at the very beginning of this presentation, before Dave started talking. It draws on thousands of, or 1,200 hours of participation in those groups. It covers a whole range of different topics. I'm not going to go through this slide, there's too much information on it for this presentation, but it draws together a whole range of different international lessons from the partners that we've been working with and those that we've been observing as part of the research that we've been conducting. Next slide, please, Roisin. And what we did was we pulled this information together, as I say. The International Standards Organization, supported through BSI, allowed us to fast track this standard, which meant that it was available within a very short space of time compared to normal standards. It was published a few days ago, and it is soon to become available through BSI. It'll be available through their webpage. And if you're interested in that, then please do contact me, and when it is available, then we'll be making that known through the Manchester briefing. So the standard covers a whole range of different phases. The first phase is agreeing the concepts. And if you've participated in one of our webinars before, you'll know that we talk about recovery, we talk about renewal, and we talk about resilience. These three distinct things: recovery about short-term activity, renewal about strategic transformation, both all focusing on resilience and building the resilience of our communities, of our places, to this changing environment that we experience through the disasters that affect us. Phase 2 talks about setting up a recovery coordination group. So these are the groups that we were following during COVID and the recovery of COVID, learning about how those groups were developed, learning about the membership, the terms of reference, the resources, and all of this is contained within the ISO as a set of prescriptive guidelines as to how can organizations develop their own recovery coordination group. Phase 3 begins to look at how do you assess the impacts of the crisis? How do you assess the impacts of the needs of our communities? And so the ISO describes how impact needs assessment can cover 6 topics. It talks about the sorts of humanitarian assistance that may be required, the economic dimensions that have been affected by the crisis, how infrastructure may have been affected, how environment, how communication, how governance, how all of these impacts might need to be addressed through recovery and through renewal. And obviously people are at the heart of what has been affected, certainly during COVID, but by every crisis and every emergency, we see the centrality of the people as well as the places that those people live and the processes that those people engage with. But really at the heart of the work that we do is putting people at the heart of that, not forgetting that when we are trying to recover, when we're trying to renew, we're doing that for the benefit of people. The standard moves on to start to prioritize what those impacts are. So which are the most important impacts that need to be addressed? Then moving into phase 4, it starts to think about, for those really important impacts, how can we recover those through some very quick, short-term transactional activity that is going to begin to address some of the concerning issues that we've seen. And Roisin, as I say, is going to talk about some of those in more detail. Phase 5 of the standard looks at how do we develop renewal strategies. So how do we begin to reimagine what the world, what our organization, what our job looks like in terms of our relationships with different people, in terms of how we work in the places that we work, in terms of the process that we've got to engage with, and looking at how the staff, the colleagues, how members of the public, citizens, how they are all going to be at the center of these transformational activities. With the whole purpose of renewal strategies, looking towards a future, looking towards a very positive future, and putting in place something that is really going to support the development of resilience for the future. Phase 6 that's described in the standard is around how do we learn, how do we do things differently, based on how do we manage delivery, but how do we really think about what we've learned during the emergency, and how do we do things differently as a result. That might mean that we need to start looking back at some of the plans, the procedures that we've got in place for dealing with similar emergencies, how we want to develop and consider the partnerships that we've got and enhance those. Or it might be looking at some of the politics that are in place and how those politics can both enable and constrain response, recovery and renewal. So a very quick canter through the international standard. As I say, this standard is available now. You can purchase it, but British Standards Institution is very grateful to them for allowing us to share this freely. I know that Dave and Shanti, who provide support to the working group that I chair, have really been instrumental in making that freely available. So I look forward to sharing that with you when I'm able to. So Roisin is going to take us through some of the dimensions of the framework that we've been developing within the university to think about how these human aspects need to be recovered. Roisin.
Thank you so much, Duncan, and hello to everybody that's joined us today. So I am going to take you through the content of the Recovery and Renewal Framework, and that's the framework that Duncan talked about in terms of underpinning ISO 22393. And hopefully I'll be able to bring the framework alive through some international examples that speak to the human aspects of resilience. So the aim of the framework is to provide an all hazards framework to support those who are developing recovery strategies and renewal initiatives. You'll see the 6 interdependent themes here of the framework highlighted in red. And these themes represent the key impact, recovery and renewal action areas relative to communities that have been impacted by disasters, economic systems, technological systems, our infrastructure, environment, health, and also governance. So the framework is under continuous development. So for example, a recent update to the framework was the inclusion of health as a standalone theme. And this reflects the emergent lessons from the last 18 months, very much given the importance of people's health and health systems with respect to our resilience to emergencies. It also reflects the anticipated prolonged impacts of the virus itself, the measures and also, so the containment measures and response measures taken on people's physical and mental health. So as mentioned, the framework underpins the ISO 22393. It also underpins the Manchester Briefing, which shares international lessons on recovery and renewal, and also our newly launched database. So the newly launched database has all of the lessons that have been shared through the Manchester Briefing, and that is at the moment at over 500 lessons. And those 500 lessons cover every single bullet point that you can see here. And very much, I suppose, to understand, I guess, the diversity of what needs to be recovered, the detail of what needs to be renewed, what other countries are thinking in terms of recovery and renewal, and what they're doing. You can very much explore these in depth through the database and search for the areas that you might have a particular interest in, and that could be a particular sector, it could be a particular group, and it could also be using the themes and the subcategories that you see here as bullet points populating the framework. So to illustrate some of the human aspects and challenges, I'm going to focus on the partnerships theme within partnerships bullet point within the governance theme, which enables the how-to and are very much the cornerstone of response and recovery and also renewal. Other themes that you'll see here relate to maybe the what and the who in relation to the people, places and processes that have been impacted by emergencies. As we've seen over the last 18 months, partnerships are the people who have worked together. They're the people who have collaborated during response and now recovery, and also those who can collaborate for renewal by capitalising on the progress made. With this, I'm also going to focus on communities, the communities theme, and some of the associated subcategories. So we've seen so many examples of how partnerships between government organisations, local communities, local businesses, the voluntary sector, and also individuals through volunteers, and how all of these collective partnerships and collective collaborative working have had made such a huge difference to vulnerable people throughout the pandemic. So the first lesson that we're going to look at here demonstrates really how partnerships can support the identification of impacts, they can support the identification of needs and also vulnerabilities, and the participation of communities and local people in these partnerships is crucial, so that local knowledge and local intelligence around need, vulnerabilities and impacts can be identified and also heard. These partnerships can also facilitate co-production of recovery strategies that restore and enhance preparedness, for example, for future emergencies, and also those renewal initiatives that aim to reduce inequalities and vulnerabilities by tackling chronic societal issues that people experience. So I'm lightly touching on these examples at the moment, but they are in the database, and you can search for these in more detail and read them in more detail as well. So this next example from New Zealand demonstrates how communities can directly inform their own local recovery and renewal, and that might be based on their specific needs, their specific priorities. So in this example here in Napaera in New Zealand, the community identified 5 key initiatives which address the issues that they see relevant or important for recovery, and also their perspectives on the opportunities for renewal and building the resilience of their community. Very much, this example highlights how communities and people are central and key to informing action and the development of initiatives that build resilience across multiple dimensions. So my next example here, so this one very much demonstrates how tackling challenges or fragilities, for example, that might exist within one area of the system can help to address wider societal challenges which create vulnerabilities that can be exacerbated during a crisis. They can also help to prepare for and also mitigate the impacts of potential risks, and collectively work to build resilience to future shocks. So this example extracts the human aspects of this city resilience strategy from Milan. And this strategy particularly focuses on improving the local food system to reduce waste. The strategy was developed through key partners and also public consultation, which enabled the community to participate and also to contribute to strategy development and implementation. A strategy like this one, for example, can produce multiple benefits across the whole of the system, but more specifically for human aspects of resilience. So, for example, the first one in terms of initiatives we have here is the redistribution of food waste through community-level food hubs. And this particular initiative might help to reduce household food insecurity, and also it could potentially establish a system that has the infrastructure and that is prepared to, for example, expand in the case of an emergency where emergency food provision is required, for example, on a larger scale, as we most definitely saw through COVID. The next one then is around shorter supply chains. So, for example, this means that local people have increased access to locally produced and healthy food. Within this strategy, this was particularly targeted at improving public health and reducing health vulnerabilities. So in this example, it was around obesity and malnutrition, and those vulnerabilities that can heighten people's risk to a health emergency such as COVID. Community gardens have enabled young people and children to be involved in community resilience and community resilience strategies, and also create those green spaces in urban areas that we have seen to be so vital to people's health and well-being throughout the pandemic, but more specifically in those periods of tight restrictions. And then the final initiative here that relates to the human aspects is focused on developing sustainable business practices. So here, I think it was approximately 20 SMEs collaborated to develop innovative solutions that support a sustainable local economy, one that both retains, protects, and also creates jobs. and also solutions that help to reduce emissions. So, for example, the shorter supply chains mentioned in the previous point reduce business costs, but also emissions through reduced transportation. And all of which very much support the mitigation and resilience to climate change impacts and the human aspects of those. So, as I mentioned, I have touched just very lightly on 3 of the over 500 lessons that we have in our database, a multitude of which will speak to the human aspects of resilience, and all of which have informed the ISO. And you can go there to find loads and loads of content around lessons that support cities to implement ISO 22393. So to conclude then, really, we've got, as Duncan took you through, the guidance on the process in the ISO. We've looked at some of the content, implementation and lessons that can be found on the database. And essentially, it could be a case where you might think, what next? So here we have some examples of how the framework might be used and some of the key questions that also might need to be asked. So, for example, you'll need to check whether impact assessments cover all of the key issues. Have you got everybody in the room, for example, key stakeholders, communities, and are all people represented? Have lessons been generated across the whole system? And are governance arrangements to deliver recovery and renewal appropriate? Are they flexible, and do they consider the prolonged nature of the pandemic? So that brings myself and Duncan's presentation to a close. But on behalf of Duncan and I, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for joining us today. I think we may have already put the links in for the Manchester briefing and the database into the chat, but we can do that for you. And I look forward to our discussion afterwards. David, I think I can hand back to you, and David's going to introduce our next speaker, Sally.
David, do you mind if I just make a comment?
Oh, yeah,
Yep,
please do.
Please do.
I'm just looking at the LinkedIn, and I can see that the video of this presentation is out on LinkedIn, and there's a whole series of questions or comments or things going on there as well. So I just wanted to give a shout out to those guys over there. Thanks for joining.
Oh, fantastic. That's brilliant.
Abby, I don't know if there's a way of just maybe bringing them to my attention for the Q&A, please, if there's some... Rashid, thank you. That was a brilliant presentation, already recognised in the chat group, actually, by people saying, yeah, really good. Thank you very much. And I know the work that's gone into the database and the TMB, for which you've been lead responsible for. You've done a fantastic job, so well done you. Right, thank you for that. Well, look, let me introduce, please, our next speaker, Sally. Sally is BS Science Lead Standards Development Manager for Business Improvement, Occupational Health and Safety Management. She's responsible for working with both national and international experts to develop documents which help organisations of all types improve the way they operate and to better protect the people who work for them. Most importantly, she's the manager of the ISO Technical Committee responsible for the world's first international standard on occupational health and safety management, something that's clearly come to the fore throughout the pandemic, ISO 45001, and also PAS 45005, guidelines on safe working during the pandemic itself, and on psychological health, safety and well-being at work, an incredibly important developing area of knowledge. I think far better, Sally, for me to hand over to you rather than me to try to explain any more of that. But Sally Smudgeworth-Fries, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. If you bear with me, everybody, I will try and share my screen and my presentation. There was a lot of numbers thrown at you then, so we'll try and break them down a little bit. But the focus of what I'll be talking about today is ISO 45003, which is the psychological health and safety standard, and how that can work to help build a more resilient post-pandemic world of work. Rasheen and Duncan have already touched on this, but people are at the heart of everything. They're certainly at the heart of organisational resilience. And nothing you're doing, any of those, how many were there, Rasheen, 700 or something, lessons learned? Nothing you're doing is going to work unless you bring your people with you. And your people aren't going to come with you unless you address their psychological health and well-being. If you are just struggling to survive, you're not going to be able to adapt to change. You're not going to be able to drive good new things forward. So we've already touched on this quite a lot. We're living through really challenging times. It's very volatile. Everything is uncertain. There's lots of upheaval, people being asked to accommodate change very, very quickly. And often multiple changes in a row. One day it's this and the next day it's something else. It's very difficult to deal with. And we have to remember that we are human beings. We're not just employees. We're not just representing our workplaces. So there's a lot of anxiety and stress about all sorts of things that are going on. It's not just the pandemic, which is still ongoing, which has been ongoing for a long time now and is having a significant effect on us. But there's been a lot of political and economic instability, individual job insecurity, social unrest, increasing societal divisions. Identity politics has become very important, with some groups feeling far worse off and actually being far worse off than others. This widespread inequity is contributing to a global mental health crisis, essentially. And then we have the climate crisis. There's all sorts of extreme weather events going on. There's a lot of change happening. And this is making people very, very anxious. It is leading to depression. It is leading to substance abuse. And the amount of work that organisations are trying to do to recover from the pandemic, to cope with all these changes, is also leading to burnout. So let's look backwards before we look forwards. Even before COVID-19, psychosocial risk, psychological health, was the biggest cause of days lost from workplaces. It is costing trillions of dollars across the world every year and has been for at least a decade, probably more, and it's growing every single year. Now, all of the figures on the screen here are pre-pandemic. So we know that the pandemic has exacerbated and accelerated everything. And the experts are predicting at least a 10-year mental health crisis. We're not in a position where we can put the idea of well-being on the back burner. We can't deal with it with yoga classes. We can't deal with it by saying, be stronger, soak it up, because you can only ask people, individuals, to be so resilient before they break. None of us can withstand pressure to the extent that we can just take on more and more and more. So ISO 45003 is there to give you practical information, recommendations, guidance on how you can manage this at work. Because when we go to work, we're bringing our stress, anxiety, depression with us from home. And if our workplace is also fueling that, we're then taking it back home with us, and we've got this vicious cycle where we're not coping with anything very well. So 45003 focuses on making organisational change. We can't change the world. We can't snap our fingers and change a spreadsheet and let pandemic go away or climate crisis go away. But there are things we can control, and that's what this standard is about. It's accessible to everybody. It's written in language that anybody can understand. It's not for psychologists. It's not even necessarily just for health and safety specialists or HR people or line managers. Anyone can read this and anybody can get something out of it. It can empower people to have conversations in their own organisation about what's causing them stress, so that then it can be tackled at an organisational level. It depends on organisational action, not individual interventions. Organisations need to understand where the risks are coming from, and generally it's from how the work is organised. At the heart of everything is how work is organised. That's what causes issues. And then the social interactions at work, as well as the work environment itself. And we'll go on to this a little bit more in a moment. And what we need to see right now is action, not just talk, not long-term planning. We have a crisis now, and I'm sure many of you in organisations will be aware of that. People will be off sick with psychological ill health. People will be struggling to cope with their workload or their work hours or the combination of home-life balance, the different responsibilities they've got in their world. So please don't think you've got to get this perfect before you do something. The key is do something, start something, and don't make it down to, oh, Rashine's not coping very well today. That's her problem. She needs to be tougher. No, if Rashine's not coping, there's something wrong with the way her work is being organised and what's being expected of her. So start there. And arm yourself with knowledge. Recognise the signs and symptoms of negative impacts and acknowledge them. Don't tell people they'll be fine. They're not fine. People are not fine. So here are some examples of hazards, and I'm not going to go through it all in detail, but role ambiguity is absolutely huge. Uncertainty really leads to stress. So one really simple thing every organisation can start doing today is communicate clearly. Be really clear in what you expect of people. Don't expect people to have complete focus on customers and what they need, but only allow them 30 seconds per customer to do it. It's not going to work. You're just going to have stressed out staff and dissatisfied customers. So, it's things like that, little things, tiny little interventions at an organisational level can have a really big impact on your staff's psychological health and well-being. Many of us have worked in isolation from our peers over the last 18 months or so. Many of us are going to continue to do so. Now, that lack of interaction with our colleagues brings its own level of stress and depression and anxiety. Many people at the moment are being asked to go back into workplaces that they haven't been in for a long time. People are very anxious about that. So don't underestimate the importance of conversation. Talk to people, listen to what people's fears are and anxieties are, and work with them. Work with them to come up with solutions. Don't impose solutions on people. Collaboration is absolutely the name of the game if you're going to have a resilient organisation. You need to work together to find solutions, and some of them will need to be tailored for individuals, but an overarching strategy that's agreed together is going to get buy-in from your workforce, and you're going to have more engagement, more productivity, because the people who work for you feel part of it, they feel in control, they feel like they have a say, they feel like they're being heard. And, I know that many organisations are struggling financially. There have been redundancies, there may well be more redundancies. Hours are being cut or being changed. The key thing there in terms of psychological health and safety and well-being is be honest, give people information early and have those conversations. Don't pretend everything's okay if it's not, because people aren't stupid. They know when something's going on, and you will manage the impacts of these things much, much better if you communicate with people early and honestly and keep that communication going, keep that channel of dialogue going. Now, social factors at work is often what we think about when we think about stress. We think about bullying or discrimination or unfairness, maybe not being paid enough for the level of work you're doing. We've had a lot of debate in society about key workers, frontline workers. And we know that many of those people are on minimum wage. They're not being rewarded at the level of value that they are providing to society. This inequity is a real issue. So really have a look at the social factors in your workplace and see where there's an issue. It starts with culture. We need leadership to commit to doing something about psychological health. We need leaders to create a culture where it's safe to speak up. If something is bothering you, or if you're stressed by something, or if you're not coping, it should be as easy to talk about that as if you've sprained your ankle. We're not there yet, but the pandemic is helping. I think, many organisations have had a wake-up call on this during the pandemic. It's just as important as physical health, because if we can't cope mentally, we're no good to anybody. We are not serving your organisation well. And that earlier slide demonstrated over half of our sickness absence days are due to mental health issues. And that was before the pandemic. It's almost certainly much, much higher now. The final chunk of 45,003 is the work environment itself. And people forget that the physical aspects of the work environment affect our psychological health. So look at that as well from an organisational point of view. You can't fix everything, but you can mitigate a lot of this. If you haven't got the tools you need to do your job, if there aren't enough resources, that's stressful. If you're working in cramped environments, if you're working at home whilst trying to homeschool and look after an elderly parent who's sick, that's stressful. Your work environment matters to your well-being, and organisations can do a lot to have conversations with people to say, how can we help? What can we do? And sometimes, even if you can't fix it, having that conversation, providing that support, and going back to how work is organised, giving your workers more control over when they work, when they take their breaks, what the schedules are, deadlines. You can help mitigate some of this. Some of us are working in very unstable environments, and the example on the screen is conflict zones, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict zone. Think about what it's like working in a school full of anxious children with anxious parents. You are soaking up a lot of other people's stress. Think about what it's like to work in the A&E department of a big hospital. There's a lot of stress. So you need to put in place enough resources to handle that, but also support systems. So people can talk about how they feel and what they're experiencing, so they have guidance on how to deal with particular situations. And so that you can debrief people after something, just let people talk about it in a safe environment, without blame, without judgment. That will help the sense of well-being. And if you build all that, you're going to have staff who are much more loyal to you, much more engaged, much more productive. They won't just be turning up for work so that they don't lose their job. They'll actually be contributing to your success. So looking forward, vaccination is bringing some degree of return to normality, but it is a new normal, and this pandemic isn't over. So we can't just throw away everything we've learned over the last 18 months, and we shouldn't be just removing all of the physical safety measures. Not least because by removing them all, you are probably building anxiety in people who will be worried that they're going to get sick by coming to work. And worker needs and expectations have changed, as have organisational needs and expectations. Many organisations have found quite a lot of people didn't want to come back to work. They've changed their minds, their priorities have changed. So if you want a good, stable workforce going forward, you've got to be a place that people want to work. You're going to be a place that people want to work if they feel safe, if they feel fairly treated, if they feel like there's no discrimination, and that their needs are important to you. So pay that attention. And psychological health is going to remain a major issue for a long, long time. Not everybody's going to bounce back from this just because the numbers of deaths are going down. For many, many people, it's been a really, really tough time. It's going to have long-term effects. Support them. Listen to them. If you listen to them and work with them on the way to come back to work or continue to work, you're going to have people who will support your business. It's the same thing. As individuals, as I said earlier, we can only take so much before we break. But if we've got an army of people helping us stand up because our organisation is supportive, we're going to get through this and recover much better. You need to work with everybody, include everybody, your night staff, your shift workers, your remote workers, your volunteers. Don't try and impose things on people when you're making a lot of changes. Work with them. If you work with them, if you agree things together, you're going to have their buy-in, they're going to do it. And aim to retain the positives that have emerged over this very difficult time. one of which is this ability to talk about stuff and to share our feelings and ask somebody how they are and mean it and actually listen to the answer. Because when we listen to the answer, we can spot the signs when somebody is just masking. They go, yes, I'm fine. And you know they're not fine. And you can perhaps find ways to support them so that they become fine. So this slide just shows you some resources and where you can get it. 45,003 is free to read on the ISO site. And I don't know if the slides are going to be shared, but the link is in there. But you can just Google ISO 45,003 free to read and it'll bring you straight to it. Also available is ISO PAS 45,005, which is another free resource about safe working during the pandemic. Now, we may have come through the initial crisis, but there's a lot of good information in there, and I would really encourage people to read it. You can put stuff in place that could prevent us from going into this return to a workplace that results in a massive flu epidemic. We don't want a winter with compromised immune systems where we all get battered and end up off work anyway, just not with COVID. So, you know, learn some of the lessons, don't lose them. That's me. Thank you.
Sally, that's an excellent walk through ways to rethink workplace hazards and stresses on the most important asset, you know, people who work for us. Just to answer the question that you raised, by the way, we will make the recordings from the presentations, the whole webinar, available. We have copies of your slides, so with your permission and Jean's permission, we'll also make sure that anybody who requests them can have them, or we can direct them directly to you, Sally, whichever you prefer. But thank you, that was excellent.
My pleasure, my pleasure. And either or both is fine. You're very welcome to get in touch.
Thank you. And we're getting some really good questions, both on the chat group and also on LinkedIn, which is really wonderful to see. So, you know, please, everybody, add into that list of questions for us to come back to, so that Sally, Jean, Dave, Duncan and Rasheen can you know, have a really good challenging Q&A session at the end of this. That would be brilliant. Okay, let me now introduce Jean Hewitt. Jean is a senior inclusive design consultant and trainer at Bureau Happold, an international integrated consultancy of engineers, consultants and advisors operating again globally. She's also an honorary senior lecturer at University College London, leading the postgraduate module design inclusive places on the MSc Health, Wellbeing and Sustainable Buildings program. She specialized in access and inclusion over the 20 years, or for over 20 years, and is an accredited member of the National Register for Access Consultants, a long-standing voluntary member of BSI's Committee for Standards in this field, contributing last year not only to the content of ISO 45003 already mentioned, but also the current technical author of the new BSI PAS 6463. Again, a lot of numbers, but Jean, I'm sure you'll explain them far better than those numbers would entail. Thank you. Jean, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. So I'm going to talk about a very narrow slice of all this, really. So people with some different needs, they make up a big part of society. And there are things that happened during the COVID experience that I wanted to share with you. So as just been said, I work in design, management of buildings and environments so they can be used and enjoyed by everyone. And that does include a lot of people who are older, people with disabilities and medical conditions, with quite a lot of focus in that area, but also it could be faith needs or people with very young children and so on. We know that COVID-19 affected everybody, but it didn't affect us equally. And for some people, it would have had a greater impact financially or socially or health-wise, or there's some people much more vulnerable. But what I want to focus on now is some of the areas where people were disadvantaged disproportionately from the way in which we intervened in our built environment in order to get us back to that new or next normal. What was it that happened, and why didn't it happen in a fair and equal way for everyone? There were lots of standards that came out during the pandemic, a huge amount. In the bottom left corner, you can see version 1 of the what became the 45005. And what had happened here is that we were keeping an eye on this, and through the BSI committee, I was asked with a colleague, Pip Jackson, who works at UCL, to comment on the first version, which was a really good guide. But I think Sally and others were very aware that it didn't cover the whole of society, and that some people hadn't had their needs particularly met well by that and other guidance. So really delighted to take part in that process. So some early false assumptions that we had spotted was the whole thing about vulnerability in terms of the disease itself, and that some people were being refused to come to work, saying, we know that you need to stay at home, you are someone who is vulnerable, when actually they wanted to come in and do their job, many of them working in the built environment. And the reason for that was assumptions around a very visual aspect, whether they could be seen to have a disability. So wheelchair users and visually impaired people in particular, this happened to, and we had to really fight their corner to say, no, I'm not actually more vulnerable to COVID than anyone else. So we mustn't associate what is a very physical appearance-wise disability or condition with something that could be happening behind the scenes. So, for example, there were many other people with diabetes or respiratory conditions who were actually at really high risk, and they weren't thought of at all because nobody knew they had them. So that was happening quite a lot. We know that everyone, I think, anticipated that mental health conditions would be worsened by the isolation, but I think we underestimated perhaps the importance of outside places. They were thought of in terms of places where we needed to exercise, but less so that people just need to be outside and connect with nature, the whole biophilic effect. So I think that was a really important thing that we know now, but at the time, I think it was really about people need to exercise, and they could do it inside, but we were losing that connectivity with nature, was really, really important to mental health, well health. Many people, of course, experienced poor mental health for the first time, and they didn't understand that they were experiencing that at first, and they didn't know where to go to help because it was the first time. They didn't have those mechanisms in place, and good workplaces were putting out some really good messaging around this and providing good support. But not everybody had the capacity, smaller companies in particular, to do that. And also they were struggling at the same time, obviously financially and in other ways, which made it really, really hard to react in such a thorough way. One of the key things I feel was around communication and information, really, really key. And there were lots of things that happened here, lots of good information coming out, but almost sometimes too much information and lots of inconsistency in how it was presented. So if you take a really simple example, like how the shops dealt with this, everybody rushed out and they got their floor stickers and they got their notice and everything, but they all did it in a slightly different way, which meant if you were someone with a visual impairment or a learning disability or early stage dementia, it was really difficult to try and work out in each store which was the one-way route and what you were meant to do. So I think in an ideal world, the government would have perhaps had BSI or someone come up with some standard symbols and a package that you could follow. And there were some good examples I've seen of someone who did this for schools, and then it took off across the world, and they did it on a voluntary basis. So I think there's a learning thing there, that the consistency of information is really, really helpful to make sure everyone follows the rules correctly. And of course, all of those temporary and directional signs, etc., should follow normal accessibility guidelines in terms of print size, good color contrast, and all of that. And I think because some of the information was really critical as to what people could and couldn't do, there should perhaps, and certainly we could look at this as we go forward, I would hope, there should be easy read versions for people with learning disabilities or people who English wasn't their first language, or whatever document they were reading wasn't in their native tongue. Audio description for people who perhaps, where there were lots of visuals going on, couldn't actually see everything that was happening. There were routes that included stairs, so one-way route, everybody's going this way, and they hadn't thought about wheelchair users or people that couldn't manage stairs easily. There were one-way systems that were very, very long for people with mobility impairments, whereas a few chairs along the way would have been really helpful to allow them to rest. And some people just couldn't see distancing markers at all, so people were being criticised and tutted at in stores and so forth because of that. And yet people were saying, oh, well, we can't guide you around the store because we can't touch anyone, and the whole social distancing was impacting there as well. Another big issue that I'm aware of is the loss of ability for people to lip read. because the face mask that everybody's wearing basically took that whole aspect away. And even if some people were thoughtful enough to do a little window in their face mask, and they quite often steam up, just as most of us with glasses would silly finds it very difficult to see as well as we normally do when we're wearing a face mask. So there's a few things around that, and the visors were generally more helpful for that actually. Outside, people were making some good interventions, or they thought they were making good interventions, and for the majority, they worked. So they were adding in cycle spaces so that more people could cycle to work. But sometimes they took away the prioritised parking and drop-off for people with a disability who actually relied on their car and couldn't get to the shops or anything else without that or get to work. There were some unsegregated one-way systems that became a bit dangerous, with pedestrians and cyclists having to mix. So if you can't hear or see the cyclist coming, that was quite a hazardous thing for people to do. And all of this meant more people were staying at home and feeling more isolated than they actually needed to be during this process. Some considerations around wheelchairs and making enough space for that. And also that when the cycle stands were thrown in, there wasn't always the usual detectable underfoot surface that allowed visually impaired people to walk around them and so on. So there's lots of minor adaptations that did happen. And I think if there'd been more information, and it's all, hindsight's wonderful, isn't it? I think we did an amazing job really in informing people, but I think it just would have been better to have a bit more of a look at some of the needs of people on the fringe of that, really, that might have some additional needs. And there are quite a lot, millions in fact, of people that were in this position. So management arrangements inside buildings, obviously we had a lot of windows being open, so the offices or wherever you were going were quite cold, and there are some people that can't cope with that. And I think, you know, that was a needs must. We needed that air quality to be improved, but basically telling people in advance what to expect would be really helpful. So again, back to information. Hand gel dispensers sometimes weren't easy to reach or to use. And if people were going good enough to go around and grab and be wiping down surfaces and everything, all of the grab rails and things in toilets should have been included in that, as well as the handrails and stairs. I personally have a choice. I don't have to hold a handrail, but there are many people that really need that. And then you've got that anxiety about what germs they might be picking up. And finally, on inside buildings, really, the fire safety arrangements need to be considered, because a lot of people, when they return to work, would normally have a PEEP arrangement, which is a personal emergency evacuation plan. And of course, we've got this hybrid working, and some people were in and some were not in. A lot of absence, you couldn't tell who was going to be there. They might be working in a different location. And the whole of that PEEPs process, which is a very individualized plan that looks at how someone gets out in an emergency when the lifts can't be used and things like that. They might need to carry down, they might need someone with them. All of that process was really broken by the hybrid working type situation and needed to be revisited. It can be done, it just needed time to do it, and I think it was being overlooked. So that was also keeping people at home unexpectedly, and I think to a degree that's also currently happening as well. So what proved helpful? There were quite a few wins. So the hands-free card readers that people have to go around buildings have proved amazing. So they're great for accessibility. They're also great for avoiding spreading germs. And there were many apps that people have started to use to find out more about COVID and other things, but also allow you to monitor density in a building and utilization. They also found that many people upped their game when using apps and found them very supportive in wayfinding generally. So I think we've all upped our game a bit on technology, which has been really helpful. And I think that will help us and allow us to bring in more technology in the future, with the confidence knowing that people can make that switch. The use of tablet technology for room signs did allow people to make dynamic last minute changes. And I think that was already, those tablet technologies were already into some of the university buildings. And I think they really probably would have been beneficial in many other buildings where you can add last minute information on one-way systems, closed, teacher not available due to COVID, whatever it is, in all sorts of environments, that would have been helpful. The sensor taps that we have in various places were much easier and have come into their own really during this, because you don't have to touch them at all. And for us in accessibility, For a long time now, we've been saying that we don't like the really high velocity hand dryers. They're very noisy, they're very distressing for a lot of people. So just moving towards disposable recycled paper hand towels was sustainably equivalent, but much better and much more thorough. It's been proved to be much better in terms of hand hygiene. So that was a big win. So we'd like people to continue doing that, really, if we could. And all of those people who would normally struggle with visual and audible noise and the bustle of public transport and open plan working, they flourished during COVID. If they didn't get ill, they flourished working in the home environment quite often because everything could be tailored to their own preferences. So not everyone found it lonely and difficult. Some people actually thrived quite well during the home working experience. So I think the other thing that's happened, which is a win, is that people are now distancing themselves more physically from people. And that can be very helpful to people who prefer a larger personal space. And I'll come on to this in a second with the other paths. But some people are very uncomfortable with too close a proximity. And that measure that's been taken and everybody seems to be observing now has been quite helpful in that respect. So this was the standard that we contributed to, got to version 3, and Sally was obviously leading on this. And there's, apart from some stuff embedded into the document, there is a whole Annex B just around accessibility and inclusion considerations, which I would commend you to have a look at if these are not considerations you're already making. So considerations for the next normal, and Sally has touched on many of these: flexibility and choice about where to work. Virtual learning can offer some flexibility for people to have a more hybrid arrangement and what suits them. I think there's lots of things we need to look at on virtual meetings to make sure people have choices on that. So I know at work, we never make people put their cameras on because some people get that sensory overload from lots and lots of cameras. So if you're someone who chooses to switch all the cameras off, you can do that. Some people benefit from video calling in terms of connectivity. So they need that contact, the visual contact, if they can't go out and meet people, and others the other way around. So we're all different. And lots of things that were missing were around body language, etc. So if you've got at least the video of someone, you might be able to pick up that a little bit. I'm not saying it's the same, but it's partway there. I think in future desk and meeting room booking systems, we'll have to provide a lot more information. So some of the things that Sally was talking about and others around the comfort and how we've got to engage and get people back and want to entice them back. I think a theatre type booking system, to my mind, would be good, that showed what each desk position or theatre position showed, what sort of quality environment was it, how near were you to the toilets, all of those things that people worry about. Is that a noisy environment, a quiet environment, and having a good mix that you can offer people as well. And of course, those workplace assessments and the fire, hopefully, that will give that quite a G up to make sure people have got appropriate peeps that are flexible to deal with a hybrid situation. In terms of that diversity of people, brings me on to the paths that I'm working on currently. And we've recognised for some time, I think everybody knows this, that we are not a one size fits all physically or neurologically, and that there are natural and normal genetic variations in how our brains work. So neurodiversity, really talking about the whole population. I'm neurotypical, 70% of people neurotypical, but 30% is a huge neurominority within which there are people with neurodivergent conditions who have an experienced sensory processing difficulties and differences with the environment. And then also people who are neurodegenerative, so it's an acquired condition such as dementia. But we can't put people in those boxes. So I'm grateful to Amanda for her image here, which is really useful. But we're all a bit messy and all neurodiverse. So I found myself I'm neurodivergent in one area only, which happens to be wayfinding. And I think everybody's a little bit like that. So we can all identify with the type of guidance we're trying to put together in this new PAS. And it's based on Helen Hamlin research, and it's come up with these different strands of what can cause difficulties. And basically, we're trying to look at how to design for people who experience sound, touch, smell, or light differently. And the fact that this PAS is coinciding now with the pandemic that has forced a massive experiment to make people homework it's quite, in a way, is a good thing, because I think we're now ready for a new way of working, and hopefully this will allow people to start thinking about people's neuro differences and look at how they might do it better. So that will be out for public consultation in October, and final publication, I hope, February time, February, March. So that I'll end there, and there's a few links on there, and I'd like to pass back to David. Thank you.
Jean, thank you. Thank you very much. I totally agree with you. A brilliant effort, I think, made throughout COVID, but some really important new understandings, which I think you've shared there fantastically well. Okay, everybody, look, we've got about 50 minutes left in the promised time that we allocated for the webinar. So I've got 3 really good questions, actually. I'm going to start with that, and let's see how far we go. First one really is for Dave Adamson. Dave, just come back to you as BSI, really. Two questions interconnected in some way. Somebody's actually asked the question of you, what does being a committee member actually entail? And the other one, which I think is also really interesting, can professionals be certified to become expert in the application of these standards? I'm hoping that's a relatively straightforward question to answer, Dave, and then we'll get into some slightly meatier issues. But Dave, would you like to have a go at that one first, please?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in terms of committee membership, the thing that people really enjoy the most is the interaction with their colleagues. I mean, certainly some organizations need to have it for their points to professional associations, whatnot. So there's always that, but largely they're enjoyable on a personal level, notwithstanding that we haven't met in some time. But the idea of how to be certified as a professional, BSI do offer. Now, I mentioned before about the standards development that's done. We actually have a sort of a ring fence. It's not such a strong one anymore, but standards makers are separated a little bit from our certification body or our commercial arm. So they do actually have some schemes whereby you can work with them and become a sort of an expert auditor working for BSI. But having said that, so does the Business Continuity Institute, and so does many other organizations. So they'll use that. So BSI is just one of many that will do that. But the short answer is yes, BSI do have schemes like that in place.
Thanks, Dave. And I see you put the link into the chat box as well, so thank you for that. I'm going to turn to Eleanor Stack, a question asked by Eleanor Stack in the chat room. Eleanor, there's an opportunity here if you'd like to ask the question for yourself, if you'd like to unmute yourself. If not, just shout up and I can ask it on your behalf. But it's a great question I'd like to share with Duncan first, then maybe back to Dave.
Thanks. So I'm interested in the disaster preparedness phase of the disaster management cycle, and I was interested in a comment that David made earlier about assessments of measurements of resilience, and I'm wondering whether there is any work ongoing in terms of tools and methodologies to develop this as part of the kind of disaster preparedness work.
Thanks, Eleanor. Brilliant question. Duncan, put you on the spot. Is there anything you'd like to share in answer? Thanks, Eleanor.
Sure. Well, given that we're talking about British standards and ISOs today, then I'll give a shout out to ISO 22392. So that's a standard that looks at conducting peer reviews. And with a number of countries, I've gone and conducted independent reviews of their disaster preparedness activities using 22392. So what it does is it takes a peer review committee through a series of questions that can be asked of the plans, of the people, of the processes that are in place in a country to see whether or not they're well prepared for an emergency. So, for example, with David Powell, we went across to Chile and we had a number of different countries represented, and we brought an international perspective of what emergency planning, emergency management meant in their different countries. We brought that to bear in Chile and provided them with some thoughts and some from our own context as to how they could improve their preparedness activities. They then went and did a whole series of work that resulted in them developing a new spontaneous volunteers process that aligned with a different standard that we've developed. I won't go into that at the moment. But so in terms of assessing or looking at how well prepared is a country or a local government, then you could usefully use ISO 22392.
And in terms of quantification and actual measurement, again, I appreciate the fact that it's a really difficult thing. I've seen methodologies at the household level, but in terms of community or organisational level, are there any tools that allow a quantifiable measurement of resilience?
I have a problem with trying to quantify resilience because it is such a movable thing. And also we tend to measure the things that we have data for rather than measuring some of the things that are so difficult. So, in the presentations today, we've been hearing some fascinating things about mental health vulnerability, financial health vulnerability, physical health vulnerability. And if we had equal measures of each of those different dimensions, then I think we'd be in a very good place, but I don't think that we have that. So the idea of being able to measure all aspects of resilience, I think, is a very big challenge. And whilst many academics or methodologies might claim to measure resilience, I think that they can possibly measure those things that we can measure, those things that we have data available for.
The known knowns.
The known knowns. That's a good way of putting it.
Got it. Thanks.
So if I can
Dave,
jump
were you
in.
wanted to add in?
Yeah, it was an interesting way that Duncan responded to that. And because as an expert, he knows the subject and he's actually done it. Whereas I'm a standardization person who creates standards. But I would have answered it in a different way. But first I would have said, how are we defining resilience, right? Because there you go. And that was why continuity got the upper hand over resilience 10, 15 years ago. Because PAS 56 was out there with the BCI, and they did want it to be measurable. By the way, some people don't like certification. In fact, they hate it. They fight against it because it adds burden to their organization's additional costs, whatnot. So they see it like that. But I'll give credit to the Continuity Institute because they pushed it and they worked and they got it to not only a national level but international level, and it's because they were able to quantify those metrics, or whatever the plural is for that, matrices, if we will. but they did a great job. So the situation with the resilience right now is it still doesn't have anything really meaty. At the end of 65,000, the one standard, it's got a maturity model. That's as much as they dare go after it. I mean, there are certainly metrics that are associated with it. I think Duncan just alluded to the various other sectors and topics. But if we take resilience to be the adaptive capacity to change, and we say that it consists of the interaction of the functioning of security, ICT, continuity, health and safety, all these sectors comprise maybe resilience, then you could actually say that in order to be resilient, you really should be able to demonstrate that you at least align, and see, I'm not even using the word certify now, or meet the requirements of some of those management systems. So that's a kind of a longer and different slant answer. I like Duncan, so it's interesting because he's gone in there and done it, and he's got something really tangible he can throw at you. Mine would be, I don't think there is anything right now that's as tangible as what he's just mentioned. What was it, 22395?
92.
Mm-hmm.
But it measures much more in a self-assessment way rather than that independent measurement that David just mentioned.
Thanks both. We have a really good question for Sally, actually, from Akasha. Akasha, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but would you like to share your question and expand on it if you feel necessary? Otherwise, again, I'll read it for you. But Akasha, please. Okay, maybe have a... Oh, yes, please. Yeah, go ahead. Please do.
Can you hear me? I'm so sorry. My internet is lagging. That's why maybe, yeah. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, please. Okay.
Yeah, all right. Thank you. So yeah, basically my question was focusing on the psychological aspects, which is very important to understand how employees are suffering or how many things which actually impact them. Let's just say there's a team of 30, like 30 people are there in a team, and 25 are super happy and they're bringing the results in. Maybe not happy, but yeah. And there are 5 people who are not really satisfied with the work process, however, what is going on. So my question being, a manager who is experienced with 20 years of experience and suddenly bringing and trying to get into a conversation with him or her, he thinks that, oh, this is a different temperament, and somehow he has brought results in 20 years that he was very satisfied with his team, but suddenly he doesn't want to give a lot of importance to those 5 people, because in the end the targets are achieved. How to bring a change in certain environment, because young managers are still adapting and they are learning, they are still in the process. But a person with such a senior level and with such seniority, how to make sure that they are able to grasp this important factor that those 5 employees also matter. It's not just those 25 who are earning and who are doing pretty well in the team. So yeah, my question being that.
Thank you. Thanks, Akasha. Sally, would you like to try to respond to that?
I shall certainly try. I think the importance of this, it comes back to, it's going to be organisational change. So it's got to be right from the very top. So those senior managers who 20 years experience, usually there's not just one. Usually they aren't the business owner or the board or whatever. There are people sitting above them. So it's got to be led from the top. And the people who are absolutely the decision makers need to be walking the walk. They need to be demonstrating it, living it, not just talking about it. And they need to be supporting those people who are finding it difficult to adapt to this new world, who would rather just sort of throw away the people who are struggling than work with them to improve them. Because those managers are suffering stress around this too. It's their psychological well-being and their health that needs to be addressed first before they can manage their teams. Do you see what I mean? But it's also peer support. If you're creating that environment where it's okay to talk about why you're not happy, what it is that's causing you anxiety or stress or burnout or depression or anything, whether it's from work-related sources or outside of work, then you're going to find that those 5 people generally will improve if you address some of the issues they raise, if they are taken seriously, if they are listened to. I think too often in the past, we've tried to force employees into ways of working and roles that simply don't suit them for whatever reason. And to a degree, this could come back to the neurodiversity that Jean was talking about. Some jobs just don't suit some people, but small adjustments can help them thrive in their work, or just a slightly different way of organising the work can help them thrive. So first of all, support those managers who are finding it difficult to adapt and difficult to support the people who are unhappy, and make the changes at the very top level. Don't put it on that manager. Make it a team effort. It's all a team effort. And as an organisation, you need to be thinking in that collaborative way. Work together to find solutions. Don't try and impose them on people. Does that help?
Yes, that does make sense, because in fact, like if the team together is working, and as you said, the peer bonding is going to make a lot of sense if all of us start talking about it, and then maybe somebody can take it up ahead when things seem better and they're clearer as to what is actually impacting. Maybe those 5 are not suffering for the same reasons, they are different. So yeah, I think that makes sense.
And almost certainly it will be different. You know, because we're all different. We've got different experiences. So we have to listen to each other.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you.
Akasha, thanks for the question. Sally, thanks for the answer. What I'm going to do is, we're running out of time, so I'm going to pose one question and then I'm going to give the speakers just a little bit of time to reflect on it. I'd like to know, as we finish, please, what one key issue our speakers think local government can think more about in order to enhance resilience. While they're doing that, Roisin, I just have a private question that's come to me, please, if I could put that to you, really around the translatability for other countries of the lessons within TMB, or indeed whether you think there are any blockages around cultures and people's, people being so different that some of the lessons are not translatable. If you'd be kind enough to answer that whilst the other speakers just give a brief thought, please, to that wider question. Jean, I'm going to come to you first on that one, just to forewarn you. Rashid?
Hi, yes, thank you so much, David. And thank you for the question. So absolutely, in terms of, and we've talked a lot about it today throughout the presentation, in terms of the different cultures, different experiences, different environments, different governance models, and different ways that people, exist within their places, the processes that surround them. Some lessons will, as some elements and some lessons and some elements of specific lessons, and not necessarily all of lessons, will be translatable, but most definitely they offer food for thought. In terms of the lessons that we've got on the database, we're looking at, I think, over 100 countries at the moment. So there is a breadth and depth in terms of context and conditions that people live within, and how they might approach their own recovery. Culture is absolutely key, and that is also something that was recently included in the framework. Understanding cultures, and I guess it brings it back to that point around co-production, in terms of speaking to the people who will be impacted by different activities, different actions, and will have the services that they receive impacted, and the places that they live impacted. So I think it's around a case of kind of, lessons creating foundations, offering thought around foundations, and some of those foundations can be treated or can be translated easily, but then in those contexts they would need to have similar foundations. But again, I think yes and no, that's probably, but I think it's like everything. And I think it was Jean who touched on it, in terms of every single one of us are different. And it's understanding that at the same time when trying to approach change, wherever that may be, whether it be within an organization or within a community.
That's a great answer. No, it's a great answer. Thank you, Roisin. Well done for picking up on that one. Okay, so going back to the original synopsis, the point of the webinar in the first place, we wanted to look towards longer term contributions to building and strengthening resilience. So, Jean, it's that shout out really, the one key issue you think local government should be prioritising or thinking about if we're going to strengthen our resilience to future shocks, given your experiences, please.
Years ago, we used to have government and local government investing in accessibility groups, making sure that people with lived experience of disability had a voice and could influence how things happened. And I think it would be really good to see widen that and make it an access and inclusion group, sort of feeding in to the local community resilience plans. So these are people with lived experience rather than people saying what they think other people might need.
Yes.
To make sure they've got a voice. And some of these people in neurodivergence are not good at joining those meetings, but in the virtual world, everything is possible.
Make it more possible. Excellent. Gee, thank you very much. Sally, over to you.
I'm going back to root causes. I want local governments to stop listening to the people who shout loudest or have most money, and start going out and listening to the people who aren't engaged in the slightest. It's all about inequity. Local governments need to tackle inequity first if we're going to cope with change, with crisis, with emergencies. Society has to become more equal. We need to make sure people are properly housed and properly fed and properly educated, and that they're listened to. Don't assume we know best. Listen to the people. Yeah,
that's the second time today, Sally, in two different webinars where that's been one of the key endpoint findings. Thank you for that. Dave, do you want to add anything before I hand over to Duncan for his answer? And also, Duncan, maybe a quick summation. Thank you. Dave?
Just on behalf of BSI, so thank you very much to the Alliance Manchester Business School and especially the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute. And to David, I thought you did your normal terrific job chairing. So over the series, flawless, and you really helped keep the conversation and keep everybody very happy. And also to the participants, the speakers, I trust Duncan's going to thank and whatnot, so I'll leave that to him. But the participants, I noticed there's some repeats over the series, so obviously something went well, that it was worth attending more than once. And so if that's anything to go by, hopefully the other series that the Institute has got scheduled for the future will be just as good. So I look forward to signing up for those as well. But thank you very much, Duncan, and David especially.
Dave, thank you. Likewise to you as well. So just before I hand over to to Duncan to answer that final question, or alternatively, Duncan, wrap up. I just want to remind everybody that the presentation, the webinar, will be available on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and also as a podcast very, very shortly. So you can re-access all of this material. We also do have copies of the slides. So just give us a shout, email us if you want individual copies. Duncan, over to you.
I think just picking up on what Dave Adamson said, I'd just like to thank the speakers, thank the people for joining, thanking our team, Abby and Andre, who have really helped with organising all of this. I think that's probably a great place to end, David, rather than me going through the sort of
that's
topics
fine.
that we talked about today.
Yeah, no problem. And then just as we kind of all depart and say good afternoon to you, just to leave you some reminders to 2 future events that we're running at the university. 23rd of September, we're going to start looking at what managing meaningful recoveries look like from an emergency manager's perspective. And then on the 15th of October, we're really going to get into what the future looks like for that profession going forward. So please do join us. All of this information will be available on the links that we've shared with you in the chat. So thanks very much to everybody. Have superb weekends. Thank you for your time. Great to see you all. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.